Good evening. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm Charlotte Duran. I'm a producer with KPCC in person. For those of you who are new to KPCC, we are a multi-platform organization. We're on the air at 89.3. We're online at kpcc.org, and we're also in person. We do lots of events just like the one you're at tonight. If you want to find out more about our events, you can check us out, kpcc.org/in-person. We have another event coming up on May 30th at the Los Angeles Theater Company or Center in downtown Los Angeles. It'll be on documenting hate as part of this 3-part series that we're doing. I'd like to introduce our collaborator tonight with First Amendment Coalition, David Snyder.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I think this is going to be a really interesting and hopefully enlightening event on an issue that is of the utmost importance today. We're living in such an intensely partisan time, almost violently partisan, and it's just this type of time where the First Amendment is both most important and I think most threatened. As people become so intensely partisan, I think they lose sight of the values, or can lose sight of the values, that underlie the First Amendment. And it's these values that my organization fights for every day. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based in the Bay Area, and we advocate for free speech and for access to government records. We have a varied set of programs that accomplish those goals, from litigation to public education to a free legal hotline that anyone can access on our website and ask questions about the First Amendment, ask questions about access under the California Public Records Act and the Federal Freedom of Information Act. So I invite you to visit our website, firstamendmentcoalition.org, and you can even sign up as a free member and get our email list. I'm looking forward to this panel. I think this is the timing of it couldn't be more perfect in a way, and I think it's important that everybody think about and understand the values of free speech, the rights of free speech, because free speech is really the oxygen for all of our other civil rights. Without the right of free speech, I think those other rights in important ways become meaningless. So I will hand it off now.
Thank you, David. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. There are 4 emergency exits in the back and also 2 here that lead right outside, right by the stairs. A few more housekeeping notes. We are live video streaming tonight, so we ask that you not video record the event, but we do want to connect with you, so please connect with us on social at KPCC in person. We're using the hashtag free speech tonight. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's host, Adolfo Guzman Lopez.
Well, thank you, everybody. Good evening. Thanks to UC Irvine for welcoming us. And thank you so much for joining us for this very important discussion. We appreciate you taking the time to be here. Tonight, we're here to talk about 3 things. We're here to talk about social media, we're here to talk about free speech, and we're here to talk about college campuses and the interaction of all 3. It goes without saying that social media is one of the defining developments of our generation. It's revolutionized how we communicate. Free speech, as David was saying, the bedrock right that's enshrined in our Constitution, and the right that we've decided as a society to protect and to promote. And with college campuses, I reported a story recently about the founding of the University of California 150 years ago, and what struck me is that at that time, it was a key time where the founders decided that this would be a university to educate the teachers, the engineers, the accountants, the people who would make this new, Western United States. So as opposed to the higher education that had educated the elite. So we're here to talk about those 3 things and about how they interact and how those things are transforming transforming society and changing them, how we are changing them and how we can best help society to that end. So tonight's talk is the second part of a three-part event series that is organized with ProPublica. Many of you may know the investigative journalism organization. We'll be doing another event with ProPublica. Actually, that one, as Charlotte was talking about, is on May 30th. It's going to look at hate crimes in Southern California. And so connect with us tonight. My handle is at A. Guzman Lopez and at KPCC in person, and we're using the hashtag free speech. So without further ado, let me bring up our panelists for tonight. Samantha Harris, who's the Vice President of Policy and Research at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. Samantha, come up and join us. Sophia Noble, who's an assistant professor at the University of Southern California. She's in the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. And Ramaya Campbell, who's a student of the class of 2018 of USC. Join us and give her a hand. You're going to be turning the tassel in about a month, is that right? Four weeks?
Yes, I will be, yes.
And David Snyder, come up and join us. As you know, David's the executive director of the First Amendment Coalition. So David, let's do a quick lightning round and let's get some definitions out of the way. The Constitution says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. But there's been a lot of case law, and a lot of time has passed since that was put on paper. So what speech is protected, David?
I think it's, in a way, it's easiest to talk about what speech is protected by talking about first what's not protected. The First Amendment's assumption is that there is no unlawful idea, and there are very few unlawful ways to express ideas. So the assumption is that that government cannot restrict speech or punish speech, with some exceptions. So I'll run through some of those exceptions as a way of, I think, expressing how broad the free speech right under the First Amendment is. But first, I think it's important to note there's a fundamental distinction when you're talking about free expression between what the government does vis-a-vis free speech or free expression and what private actors do vis-a-vis free speech or free expression. The First Amendment is only about what the government does. The First Amendment has nothing to do with what Twitter decides it wants to allow on its platform, or Facebook decides what it wants to allow on its platform, or what a private employer decides it wants to allow its employees to say. So the First Amendment, first and foremost, is about what the government can do related to speech. And so there are some exceptions to the underlying free speech rule. One, for example, is perjury. Perjury is only speech. It's a lie under oath, and you can be criminally prosecuted for lying under oath. The First Amendment doesn't stop the government from doing that. Another form of expressive activity that is not protected is child pornography. Under federal law and the law, I think, of most states, it's not only a crime to create and distribute that kind of material, but even to own it. But I don't think there's any question it is expressive activity, but it's expressive activity that is not protected under the First Amendment. There are several other categories that I think get a little mushier, and it helps, you sort of have to see what the specific facts are to understand how these exceptions to the rule operate. But one is what the Supreme Court has referred to as true threats. So a specific threat of violence against a specific individual that is likely to occur, and that threat is made with the intent to carry out the threat, is not protected under the First Amendment. But it's very specific. It has to be something that is specifically directed at an individual. Making comments about groups of people, threatening violence in a rhetorical way, saying, we should overthrow the government at a rally, all of that's going to be protected speech. But the bottom line, and I think the most important thing to keep in mind, is that the free speech rights under the First Amendment are extremely broad. There are some exceptions, and those exceptions, as a general matter, are interpreted very narrowly by courts.
And so I'm going to ask you this question, but I'll ask each of you to answer the same question from your perspective. David, how has social media, the various platforms, how has social media changed free speech as we used to know it, 30, 40 years ago?
Yeah, that's a question that I'm sure libraries full of dissertations will attempt to answer in the coming years. But if I could put that question in the college context, I think it might sort of serve the broader topic, but I think it's also an interesting case study in a way. I think there is a perception out there that college students view free speech rights differently now than they did a generation ago or 2 generations ago. And I don't know if that's true. I know that there is polling that suggests that while college students support the idea of free speech in the abstract quite broadly, they're a little, or maybe a lot, less sanguine about those rights when it comes to speech that they disagree with. And you see commentary after commentary in the newspaper and online about college students don't understand the First Amendment, free speech, the way my generation did. And there may be some truth to that. I think there probably has been a shift. But I think social media has played a role in that shift. But I think it's important to first look at the different contexts in which free speech battles arose in the past on campuses versus now. In the 1960s, the free speech movement, which started at UC Berkeley and grew from there, that was about students fighting for their own rights to speak freely. That was about students battling administrations that didn't want them to protest issues that didn't have some direct bearing on the curriculum or the purpose of the university. And so it's not surprising that if you were to ask, I think, college students at that time, do you believe in free speech? Well, they'd say yes, they're fighting for their own rights. The battles that we've seen, or at least the most high-profile battles we've seen about free speech on campus over the last year and a half, haven't been about that at all. They've been about outsiders coming to campuses and expressing viewpoints that maybe large majorities of those student bodies really disagree with, and maybe large majorities of the American public. So it's a different posture. Mm-hmm. And so I think at our peril, we make too much of the fact that polling seems to show, well, college students are willing to restrict speech. With that backdrop, I would say that social media has affected, I think, the way in which we view what can or cannot be restricted by way of speech. So, and for a generation that sort of grew up on Twitter and regularly communicates on these private digital platforms, they may have expectations about what types of speech can be blocked or banned that are inconsistent with what the First Amendment says about what types of speech can be blocked and banned in the non-digital, non-private world. So hate speech may be subject to being restricted by Twitter, and the First Amendment has nothing to say about that. If you've come up in an environment where you're expecting that kind of speech is going to be silenced, you may be surprised when you go out into the non-digital, non-private world to find that type of speech really can't be restricted, at least at public universities, in quite the same way. And another aspect of social media that I think has really changed the equation is that it's such a blunt and often ugly instrument of speech. And people, it's a cesspool out there in some of these platforms, and people are exposed to and engage in kind of extreme speech that I think, for reasons that, again, many dissertations will try to explore over the years, didn't happen as much before the rise of social media.
So let's ask a college student, Ramaya, what are your beliefs on free speech, and how have they changed over the last 3.5 years that you've been in college?
I think with regards to students being surprised, having grown up in the realm of social media, I don't remember when there wasn't social media. I do, but I don't. That wasn't a relevant part of my life, and so yes, we're the generation that's grown up on social media, which is, for all intents and purposes, despite, Zuckerberg hearings and, new questions about, government regulation, it's still the Wild West. And we're a generation that's grown up knowing that you can say anything on the internet. You can be anyone on the internet. And so free speech is kind of been ingrained into me and a lot of my peers because that's the world we know. But I think we're also the generation that grew up with peers who've committed suicide because of cyberbullying. We've grown up with people whose public profiles have been targeted and decimated because of free speech in this Wild West social media.
So how has your willingness to, really engage deeply with people on those platforms, on those comment sections, has that changed in the last 3.5 years for you?
Well, I think there's absolutely, because when I started my college career, I was, I was the person you don't like on Facebook, right? If I was willing to argue. I thought I was a very good arguer. I still think I am. But I was willing to engage with ideas that I did not agree with ideas that I felt like had no place in American democracy. I was willing to defend myself and my person and, the persons of my peers. I believed that and still believe that, everybody, specifically on a college campus, had the right to be there without fear for their person. And I think a lot of free speech, quote-unquote free speech advocates on college campuses would disagree with me on that. The idea that, I call it the snowflake theory, right? The idea that you should have to toughen up. It's a college campus, deal with it.
So do you keep using the same force in your comments?
I no longer use the same force because I like my breath and I don't like to waste it. I think that I have found better outlets for engaging issues that are very important to me, but I don't discourage the use of social media to fight back. Mm-hmm. That is an outlet that is so new to this generation and so necessary, and I think because we are so hyper-aware now in this generation, we're aware of the world around us, we're aware of these issues, and you need an outlet. So the same thing that causes you to need an outlet is your outlet, and I think that's fair, and I think as a millennial, that's the world we know, and it's evidently here to stay.
Sophia, one of your areas of expertise is the engineering of search engines and that sort of thing. Same question to you. How has social media affected free speech?
It's a great question, and I really enjoyed this conversation so far because one of the things that I think is interesting is this notion that the internet is the metaphor of the Wild West has been invoked, that it's a free speech zone, that anything goes on the web. But that's really not true. As I think David kind of alluded to, private platforms that people are engaging with have all kinds of moderating strategies, whether that's containing speech to 280 characters or 140 characters in the past, whether it's the use of hidden labor forces like commercial content moderators, which my colleague Sarah Roberts does great work around at UCLA. There are people who are, in fact, regulating and curtailing the types of speech that are visible. And part of that's because certain types of speech acts are against the law, are illegal. Trafficking in child pornography, for example, is a type of speech act that some might argue for, but that is certainly regulated online. There are platforms, in fact, we see now, even Twitter just last week closed a request for proposal on thinking about regulating the health of their environment because the speech acts that happen there have proliferated all kinds of hate.
Are they doing this because they're fearful of losing users, or are they fearful of pressure from the government? Why are they doing this?
I think it's a complex web of concerns. Certainly there are people who have left the platforms. Facebook and Twitter in particular have seen this exodus of Ramaya's generation in particular. But I think it also... there are some tech executives who hadn't anticipated that their platforms would be used, say, in the direct undermining of democracy. and who maybe don't want to be active participants in that and are thinking through the ways that their platforms have been co-opted by outside interests outside of the United States and also internal.
It's not a good business model, is it?
It's not a good business model to sell the unraveling of your country. So I think that there are people concerned about that. I also think that we're talking about, when we talk about speech online in particular, the amount of content that is coming into these platforms cannot be understood well enough. YouTube alone, if we think about YouTube as just one space where speech is happening, kind of in a video context, the latest statistic that a YouTube vice president said on Good Morning America a few months ago was that they have about 400 hours per minute per day, 24/7, being uploaded to the web. 400 hours per minute. When you talk about that volume of content that's moving through these platforms, companies have to use both software to vet some of that content and try to make sense of it, but they also have huge workforces who are looking at the content and trying to make sense of it. So I think it's a bit of a misnomer to think that the internet is a place where anything goes, because in many ways, though it seems like that on some level, there are some limits to that. But certainly our engagements with the internet are shaping the way we think about what we can do offline as well, and I think are pushing in some ways the boundaries of what we think we can do. And so it is a complex environment that we're talking about when we talk about speech online.
Okay. Samantha Harris, your organization gets a lot of calls and emails from people who are exercising their free speech rights, and they end up suffering consequences either as students or as faculty, as staff at colleges and universities for exercising that those free speech rights. Same question to you. How has social media affected free speech from your point of view?
So there are sort of two separate questions, I think. One is, how has social media affected the development of free speech law and the way we think about when and where speech can be restricted? And I'll talk about that for a second. And then there's just the question of how social media has affected discourse, which I think is sort of a separate question that we're starting to get into. The interesting thing that social media has done from a legal perspective, and you talked about this a little bit with cyberbullying, is that it's really blurred the distinction about where speech is taking place, right? It used to be, when it comes to the law of speech in school, that a college or a public school had an interest in regulating speech that took place on school property, but not off school property. But now that distinction between on and off campus has been very blurred. If somebody is being harassed by another student, or even someone who's a non-student off campus after school hours, but in a way that severely impacts their ability to attend school, for example, that may be a concern of the school legally in a way that it wouldn't have been before social media sort of blurred this line between on and off campus. So there are some interesting cases about that, but I think the bigger question is, how has social media changed the nature of discourse and the kind of cases that we get at FIRE as a result of that discourse? I find that it's really, I think, coarsened discourse in a way and contributed to the hyper-partisan environment in which we find ourselves. And I think there are a couple of reasons. One, I think that it's just much easier to dehumanize the people you disagree with when you're behind that kind of screen. I was chatting with David before the event, and I was saying I think it's a little bit like, the way that when people are in cars, they will behave towards other drivers in ways that they would never behave face-to-face with someone. I think social media provides that same sort of dehumanization. There have been a couple of interesting news items within the last couple of years about people, I'm thinking of Sarah Silverman and Lindy West, who've actually confronted with and attempted to engage with their internet trolls. And when they actually reached out to these people and made a human connection, it's not like they became best friends, but that the person who was spewing almost unthinkable hate suddenly, when confronted with a real person who said, hey, that hurt my feelings, and was very different. And while they may not have come to an agreement, they made a human connection that just doesn't happen on social media. It's also, I think, contributed to the hyperpolarization by creating these echo chambers, which I think are very problematic, and I won't spend too much time on it now. It's going to come up in other things I say, I'm sure. But, I don't know, you probably know more about how the algorithms work that determine what we see on social media. But I think that because so many people now get their news through social media, and because studies have shown that, we're more likely to be friends with people who think the same way that we do, we're seeing news articles primarily that are posted by our friends, so we're learning about issues through news outlets that probably align with our political views. And as a result, we are not being exposed to the strongest arguments for the other side, which is something that if you want to be a good advocate for your own beliefs is really critical, and it's one of the reasons that free speech is so important. But I think that, particularly on campus, we talk about free speech as being essential to the marketplace of ideas, but I think that the way social media has filtered the way we get our news and created these echo chambers has really diminished the marketplace of ideas.
So we're on a college campus. We're talking about these issues. Should we be concerned about what's happening on the college campus? Because this is the ideal world. This is where the students' views of how an administration above them, the rights that they're given. So if there's a chilling effect on campus, that they get used to, does that get them used to a chilling effect by the government? Is that why talking about what's happening on campuses is important, Samantha?
I think it's important for a number of reasons. I mean, one is just that our campuses are where we are training our future leaders and influencers, and we want them to be well-educated and good advocates for their views. And so I think that, first of all, if they're not being exposed to those views, FIRE recently did a poll of college students about their attitudes towards free speech, and one of the things that we found is that a majority of college students have reported self-censoring in the classroom at some point during their college experience. So if students on campus, which is supposed to be, the real marketplace of ideas, feel that they cannot express themselves freely and talk about their viewpoints, yes, I fear that they're going to go out into the world with that same restraint.
Sophia, what have you seen in your classrooms over the years that you've taught in terms of students' willingness to engage in tough debates and bring out tough ideas in the classroom?
I think it's a great question. I mean, I've definitely seen over the last decade the suppression and self-censoring that's happening in the classroom and with students. And I think part of that is because, we talked about the kind of generational conceptions of what our rights are to speech. I think now with the introduction of social media, and, I have to say, the internet itself is kind of a project, a deep psychological experiment that has been unleashed on the public kind of without our consent. I mean, we didn't actually vote for that in advance, and it's radically...
It's not in the terms of agreement?
It's not. We didn't click quite that box. And so here we are with students who are hyper aware that the person next to them might be surveilling them or recording them. Wow. Their certainly faculty are aware of that. What do you do
in your classroom, Sophia, in terms of, do you tell them that you cannot record?
Yes, I do. Okay. But I do that not so much because I'm concerned about anything that will come out of my mouth or theirs. What I do is I really kind of require, strongly encourage a laptop and device-free classroom, mostly because I don't want the mediation of the technology standing between me and the students in our conversations. And that mediation that we're talking about, that I think Samantha alluded to, is very strong in either a huge distraction psychologically for them, but also that they don't feel that the classroom is any longer a learning lab. It actually becomes a performative space. And one of the things that to me is very important about a classroom and a college campus, and I tell this to my students, is that this is the place where we experiment with ideas. We try on all kinds of ideas. You're going to be exposed to ideas that you've never maybe been exposed to before.
Do they get it by the end of the semester?
They absolutely get it, and by the end of the semester. But you have to create an environment that doesn't have these kinds of stressors, like being captured and recorded and then put onto social media while you're trying to figure out what you think about something. And not having the space to engage with ideas and really figure out, who am I? What do I believe? What is that informed by? Do I have evidence to support, or facts to support my position? That takes some time to work out. That isn't something that happens instantaneously. And one of the problems, I think, with social media and the internet, particularly search engines and other kind of information resources, is that there's an increasing expectation that instantly we can have an answer and instantly we can know. And in fact, that's antithetical to the knowledge production and the kind of the knowledge creation experience. And that's something that I think is dramatically affecting students.
Ramaya, what do you think of this idea that Sophia is talking about, this idea of shell-shocked students from, the comments and the back and forth, the cesspool, and that affecting how they behave, how students engage with each other or not in the classroom?
I think that, when you're friends with people on Facebook who you know on campus who are in your classes and their opinions differ from you, you kind of sit in this classroom like it's a minefield. At least that's my experience. And I can look out into a sea of my peers and know this is how they feel, this is how they feel, this is how they feel, this is how they won't answer, this is how they will. But I think in my experience that the way that students are inhibited from engaging has been not just with laptops, because yes, guilty as charged, laptops are a distraction in classrooms. I'm not going to close mine. But the professor has such a large role to play in creating the environment you're referring to. And now I wish I had been able to take your class, because my experience with professors in the classroom has not helped the shell-shocked feeling of social media at all, specifically with regards to any semester in 2016. Professors have opinions, and they have rights to all of their opinions, but it's their prerogative to decide how polarized they're going to make their classroom. And I think, in my experience, students, I've seen students self-censor. I've had friends who have sat in a classroom and I'm like, I know they have an opinion. I know they have some sort of dissent to this conversation.
Do you talk to them afterward about that?
Typically, I like to play devil's advocate in a classroom, so I would just take their dissent as my own. I'm a pretty vocal person in the classroom, so most people could tell I'm playing devil's advocate, but I think it's a shame that somebody would have to play devil's advocate in a classroom that is so diverse, that has such a diversity of opinions, but they're not heard.
Yeah.
So then you have a student like myself who cares about creating this environment, right, who has to step into the role of students who have silenced themselves, and that's not the academic ideal to which we should hope to aspire. Right?
One of the reasons that I think it's important to have this discussion at UC Irvine is you all here have a chancellor who wrote the book on free speech. Well, he co-wrote the book on free speech, as you know. Howard Gilman and Erwin Chemerinsky taught a free speech class, and that resulted in a book about it. I'd like to have the mic given to somebody here, Joseph Morales, who's the Assistant Director for Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships for UC Irvine's Office of Inclusive Excellence. And Joseph, I first want to get your reaction to what you're hearing, this dynamic that Ramaya is talking about in the classroom. What's your reaction?
I have taught a class called Freedom for the Thought That We Hate. And I will say that in that class, cyberbullying was a very popular topic. And so students, had a lot of, it didn't sit well with them, with the notion that hate speech could be free speech. And so students really, were drawn to that. And of course, the consequences of cyberbullying leading to suicide or something of that nature, they were curious, is this really a protected form of speech? Is it not harassment, for example? So these are the kinds of thoughts that the students had.
What was your goal in that class?
Well, the purpose of the class was to teach argumentation, but really it gave a biography of the First Amendment. That's the subtitle of the text. And so to see how the First Amendment has changed over time, what people understand it to mean. And of course, It was written post 9/11, so it focused a lot on that. But the students took it to the next level. They were looking at the dark web. They were looking at cyberbullying. They were looking at, code. Can I borrow code? Is that, open access? Or, so a lot of different things like that. But yeah, I do think cyberbullying was a mainstay.
Tell me about what UC Irvine is doing, besides the class that you taught. What are you all doing to instill these values and get students and faculty to talk about these things?
Well, we have a number of initiatives in the Office of Inclusive Excellence, and as the campus becomes more and more diverse, we are a designated minority-serving institution now, free speech becomes more and more important, of course. And so the Office of Inclusive Excellence has a number of initiatives confronting extremism, for example, where we recently brought the Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. to campus, where he modeled a conversation about Charlottesville. We also have opportunity to model thoughts. We have individuals who speak on anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. That's part of our perspectives on bias, prejudice, and bigotry. That's also connected to a freshman seminar series where students have an opportunity to experiment with anti-Semitism, to engage with thoughts about anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia. It's a year-long sequence. So, I think ideally, right, the campus is trying to enter that marketplace of ideas, right, to offer that, but also to, given the current climate, to have the campus be a space, or I should say, not literally, but a battleground of sorts where there's an exchange of ideas, right, figuratively speaking, not a literal battleground as we've seen.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Joseph. We may come back to you a little bit later on in the discussion. And we're going to be coming to the audience in a few minutes. So have you a question in mind, whether it's a reaction to what you're hearing here, or I also want to hear about the experiences here at UC Irvine, how what you're hearing from the panel either resonates. Do you agree? Is this what's happening in your classroom if you're a staff member or a student here? Samantha, I want you to talk about 3 hours ago, you sent me an email of something, just that the latest case of a faculty member, kind of put in peril, maybe in quotation marks, because of the speech that she used. Can you tell me a little bit about the case? What happened out of Cal State Fresno?
Yes. So, as you probably know, former First Lady Barbara Bush died, I think it was yesterday. And so this professor at Fresno State, Randa Jarrar, tweeted out a rather tactless celebration of Barbara Bush's death, saying, I'm glad she's dead. She was the mother of a war criminal, and she's a racist, and I can't wait for the rest of her family to die like the 1.5 million Iraqis. And then, when people pushed back against her and said, you should be fired for what she said, I'm a tenured professor. They can't fire me. Now, this is actually true. So at a public university, as David mentioned, there's a distinction. Public universities are considered state actors. So a public university is bound by the First Amendment in a way that private universities are not. Although there are free speech concerns at private universities too, and FIRE defends the rights of a lot of faculty and students at private universities. But in this case, the First Amendment principles are very clear. She was speaking as a private citizen on a matter of public concern. It's not as if she, represented that she was speaking on behalf of the university. And she can't be fired for that, consistent with the First Amendment. And initially, Fresno State appeared to acknowledge this and issued a statement saying, look, these statements are not consistent with our institutional values of respect and civility and so forth. But, she was speaking in her private capacity, and she has the right to do that. But then, as often happens, a phenomenon we haven't quite gotten to yet on social media are these outrage mobs, these outrage campaigns that happen. Someone says something and one person retweets it to their friends, and then suddenly, a university will find itself flooded with, hate mail and demands that someone be fired, and presumably that is what has been happening to
Well,
the
and that's
administration.
one of the transformative parts of social media. It's part of the Me Too movement.
Yes.
Backed up by reporting, backed up by actual experiences, actual people coming forward. This, mass of people saying this happened or reacting is part of the good thing about social media, right?
It can be, yes. But it can also lead universities, I think, often just in a reaction, in an effort to protect their brand, to protect themselves from criticism, to take actions that aren't necessarily consistent with protecting the right to free speech. So there's been no official action yet, but Fresno State has shifted from saying that this was fully protected to saying that they're now investigating.
So do all campuses, respect free speech rights?
No.
Give me some examples of the ones that have taken immediate action.
Well, so, staying on this general theme of sort of social media and media, there's a case going on right now, there's a lawsuit. Essex County College, which is a college in New Jersey, a faculty member there, Lisa Durden, appeared on Tucker Carlson, and she defended the right of Black Lives Matter to hold an event that was limited to people of color. She didn't get on there and say, I'm Professor, Lisa Durden from such and such college. She spoke, she was just listed as a political activist. She spoke, again, in her capacity as a private citizen on a matter of public concern. But Essex County College actually terminated her, and she is now suing them for violating her constitutional right to free speech. I think she has a very strong case. I mean, the litigation is in its earliest stages. But so that's sort of the most extreme where someone's fired. Often what will happen is that a school will simply make it very difficult for someone to continue to function on campus. So Drexel University, which is a private institution, so this isn't a First Amendment case per se, but there was a professor there who tweeted out before Christmas, he tweeted out, "All I want for Christmas is white genocide." And this generated a lot of outrage on Twitter, and in another sort of interesting plot twist that highlights the way social media amplifies these things, the Twitter account that caused his tweet to go viral was later found to be, by someone investigating it at FIRE, a Russian Twitter bot. But so anyway, Drexel didn't fire him. They said they were investigating him, but they also said that because of all of the outrage, they couldn't guarantee his safety on campus, and so they limited him to teaching his course online, and basically made it so difficult for him that he resigned. And in his statement resigning, he said, and I think that this is a really important, I'll end with this, and this little talk part with this, is that he said, we are all a single outrage campaign away from having no rights at all. So wow. I thought that was really, sort of representative.
David, can you comment on that? Because this goes to the issue of what your organization is trying to do, which is to educate people about First Amendment rights.
Yeah, I was gonna rudely jump in anyway, but thank you for the invitation. So there's a concept that's really important now. It's always been really important, but I think it's much more important now than it has been in a long time, partly because of the high passions that we see and these outrage mobs that form, and that is the concept of the tyranny of the majority. One of the philosophical underpinnings of the First Amendment is that it is of the utmost importance to protect minority viewpoints. And by minority, I mean in a numerical sense. In other words, the most extreme viewpoints in society are the most important to protect because those are the ones that the government will go after. And the tyranny of the majority is a formidable force. And whoever happens to be in the political majority at any given moment has the political power to silence extreme views. But one person's extreme views are another person's enlightenment. The things that Martin Luther King said while he was alive were very extreme for some parts of the country, for many parts of the country. Now they're taken as sort of a given and as gospel. And so it is really easy for us to lose sight of the importance of allowing these extreme views to go forward when there's so much passion and there's so much hurt, frankly, I think partly as a result of social media, from the most harmful and hurtful things that people say. We don't want to let that speech go forward. One thing I try to remind people when this comes up in conversations with reporters and others is that allowing speech to go forward, government allowing speech to go forward or not punishing speech is not the same thing as endorsing it. When students are protesting and faculty there were faculty at UC Berkeley, over 100 of them, who urged the university to not let Milo Yiannopoulos speak on campus, period. And there were some law professors in there too. And that is a really, really difficult ask, I'll say, for reasons I'll explain in a moment. But they seem to be equating, if not explicitly, at least by implication, the university permitting the speech to happen with the university condoning the speech and endorsing the speech. And the university administration's response, to their credit, was, no, we have a constitutional, we can't, consistent with the United States Constitution, just tell this guy not to show up and speak because we don't like what he's going to say. We have an obligation to let him speak as a state institution, but we can criticize it, and we're going to do that right now. We think he's a hateful, awful person, and no one should listen to him. And there was someone on the faculty who said the best thing you could do with Milo Yiannopoulos' speech is not show up. If he had an empty audience to speak to, that would be the best option of all, because we wouldn't have prevented him from going forward and speaking, but he wouldn't have even had an audience to begin with. So the one point that I want to make is this distinction between, this goes back to the UC Berkeley professors asking the administration to not let Milo Yiannopoulos speak. There's an important distinction in First Amendment law between punishing speech after it occurs and preventing speech from going forward at all in the first place. And the latter is basically verboten under the First Amendment. I know of no instance where an injunction issued by a court that prevented speech from happening, so an injunction that would prevent publication in a newspaper, an injunction that would prevent someone from saying something orally, was held to be constitutional. It doesn't happen. There are instances where the government can act to prevent speech before it happens, such as when an employee of the CIA leaves employment and signs an agreement that he's not going to disclose classified information, and he can't do that, and he has to abide by that agreement. That is a prior restraint, but it's a narrow exception in a very specific context. So preventing speech from going forward is basically verboten. Punishing speech after it happens is also suspect under the First Amendment, but it's a much, much more favorable outcome because at least the speech is heard, in theory, the speech was made, and this marketplace of ideas concept that underlies the point of free speech takes the basic position that it's better to let it all get out there and let everyone evaluate it and decide what they agree with or disagree with and speak out against it than for the government to be in the business of deciding what's not acceptable to say. Because I can tell you for a fact, I can guarantee that how Donald Trump would define hate speech would be vastly different from how the University of California, Berkeley would define hate speech. And so one question I would ask the faculty at UC Berkeley that said, don't let Milo Yiannopoulos go forward, do you want Donald Trump defining what's appropriate speech for you? And I'm sure the answer would be no, but it's hard for people in these passionate moments to step outside that passion and recognize that once we let the government start making decisions about what is appropriate or what is acceptable speech, we're starting down a very dangerous road.
Let's get some microphones out. Can you raise your hand if you have a comment or a question? I see somebody with a white shirt in the back. Just tell us your name and what you do and your question.
My name is Kapil Dan Dumudi. I'm an adjunct professor here at UC Irvine and also an attorney. My question is for David, and this is regarding sort of the impasse between administration and students on campuses. We've seen in a lot of situations that administrations are quick to pass, rules on campus for free speech zones, while students are quick to try and shout down speech that they don't agree with. How do we resolve this impasse? How do we make it so that both sides of the equation are more open to the free flow of ideas and the exchange of those ideas on campus?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And Sam, I think, knows a lot more about free speech zones and their origins and effects and where they're probably headed than I do. But I think it's probably safe to say that free speech zones, I hope, are kind of on their way out. I think so many of them are so tiny. It's almost like some of the stories that I read, and again, Sam knows a lot more about these than I do, but the free speech zone is like 2 spaces in a parking lot on the northeast corner of campus. And it's just like, you can't do that. The Constitution allows time, place, manner restrictions, but it doesn't permit you to sort of put people who want to exercise their expressive activities in Siberia. That's not allowed. So your point is, well, why are administrations, why do they seem to be so enamored with these free speech zones? And in the 90s, 80s, and 90s, it was speech codes, what's acceptable to say and what's not acceptable to say. And I don't know the answer to that, other than that when people get into positions of political power, they want to exercise that power. And the framers of the Constitution, and in particular the First Amendment, recognize the danger in that the interests of the people governing the governed may, and often, very, very often do, trample on civil liberties and personal liberties. There's another, I think, point of discord between administrators and students on college campuses that has cropped up in a few instances that I think actually runs the other direction. And I'll go back to the University of California, Berkeley example. The administration in that instance, I think, made the right call. But there were many, many students who vociferously and passionately disagreed with the call that the university made. And I think they had some good reasons to disagree, or at least good reasons to supporting their passion. And part of this goes back to, I think they felt oppressed by the university's decision. And part of this goes back to the point I made earlier about the 1960s being about students exercising their own free speech rights and fighting for their own free speech rights. And now, in the instance of UC Berkeley, when Ann Coulter showed up, when Milo Yiannopoulos showed up, they feel sort of subjugated in an odd way by the university's insistence on free speech. We're in a weird, topsy-turvy world, because I don't think that's right, but I totally understand where it's coming from. There are so many questions relating to free speech these days that are hard to answer, in part because of these passions that we see, and maybe even more so because of social media. It has just created this entirely new way of communicating where the old definitions in some ways don't really apply. Censorship has always been understood as government acting to stop something from happening. And when I was a kid, that was relatively easy for government to do, at least in theory. There were choke points in the communications ecosystem. There were gatekeepers that allowed information to go out to the people. The Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, ABC, CBS, and what's the other one? NBC. The other one. And that was it. Like if information was going to get out to the public, those were the points. And the government could, in theory, stop the information from flowing through those 3 or 4 points. Now I think censorship is almost more about preventing people from, it's almost more about drowning someone out with so much information, the self-censorship that you described with your students, and the censorship that goes on online. It's not about the government stepping in and stopping speech necessarily, as much as it is about speech, valuable speech, being overwhelmed by these outrage mobs and by this just ocean of communication.
Well, let me ask a follow-up question from the professor. What have you seen here on campus at UC Irvine in terms of students' willingness or unwillingness to use their free speech rights?
Right. So I graduated from this university about 10 years ago, and as I was matriculating here, obviously we were sort of in the throes of the Iraq War at the time, and at that time it seemed very significant that people had the type of dissenting views potentially that may be important to the conversation. And as I've grown, as I've begun my own practice, as I've started teaching here, I think I've noticed that that the students, and again, I don't want to spam, some of my students are actually here from my class right now, but the students tend to, they tend to take sort of convenient positions at times that don't necessarily go the extra step in actually trying to debate some of these important issues. And I've noticed, I'll give you an example. We had Ann Coulter come on campus when I was a student here, and she was able to speak. She spoke. There was a protest, obviously, given where she was. But I don't think that Ann Coulter could come on this campus again and actually give a talk, now in this day and age, because I feel like the amount of outrage that would pour out from the student body would be enough to make it impossible.
Do you study the incident that happened here at UC Irvine where the Israeli ambassador was shouted down by students?
I recall hearing about it, but I myself was not here when that happened. But we have a very rich history on this campus of sort of pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli groups fighting with each other. So take that for what you will.
Samantha, going back to the idea of free speech zones, are they, as David was suggesting, are they on their way out?
I think to some degree they are, because they have been really roundly rejected by courts. And FIRE actually does a lot of litigation around free speech zones. I mean, I think as much as in some ways free speech has become a partisan issue, the issue of free speech zones and the issue of using these kinds of prior restraints to suppress student protest is something that has wide support among the idea that these are wrong has wide support among the student body and the general public. So these are some of the most unpopular restrictions on speech, both with the public and in the courts. So I do think in some ways they're on their way out. And I wanted to add, in terms of why they're popular, I think that a lot of restrictions on speech put in place by administrators, particularly free speech zones, and sort of their cousins, which are things like permit requirements, other kinds of prior restraints. It may not be that, we just settled a case at a college in Illinois where a student was trying to hand out flyers on campus, but she was told that she couldn't because she hadn't gotten the necessary permit in advance. And that's also sort of a prior restraint on speech. And I think a lot of them come from a place of universities being very afraid of disorder on campus and very afraid of disorderly protest. And while disorderly protest, a protest that leads to violence or to a speaker being shouted down or someone distributing flyers and littering the campus with them, while all of those things may be things the university could address after the fact, the problem is that universities are so concerned with protecting order that they impose, rather than just punish disorderly conduct after the fact, they'll impose these prior restraints that in fact infringe on a lot of what would not ultimately be disorderly speech or conduct.
Do you think there's been a generation that's gotten used to those kinds of rules and they say, oh, that's how life is?
I don't think so. Like I said, I think that, as much as some aspects of the free speech battle have been, I think, unnecessarily made into a partisan issue, this is one I think across the board students understand the problem with and reject, because everybody understands the need to allow protest and for students to be able to engage in that kind of thing. And so that's not a type of restriction that I see a lot of student support for, which is a good thing.
Okay. We have a question right there.
Oh, thanks. Jerry Binder. I've been in higher education for 50 years. My alma mater is UCI. I got my PhD here. I think I might have been in the first graduating class for PhDs back in 72, 73. And I just love your fertile minds. I just love all this conversation I'm hearing. And it's just really giving a lot of texture to this whole topic that is on my mind a lot as I'm in my classes. But I wanted to add something a little different to all of this, which is the role of the professor in the classroom, which I've been in for 50 years at 2 private universities and then University of California system. It scares me that students respect professors too much and sit there like sheep and put up with our crap. Not my crap, of course. It scares me that opinions come out from the front of the room disguised as ideas when they're just private opinions. And I have told my classes for decades, if you want to do really well in this class, don't hide behind the kid in front of you. Raise your hand, speak up, challenge me, ask for backup, ask for empirical evidence, ask for something credible, ask for books, sources that I've read. So you are getting more than just the pompous professor's opinion. And a great way to fail this class is just sit there, dutifully take notes. This is before, keyboarding. And remember everything and then regurgitate it. And you will join a nation of sheep. And, you'll waste your parents' money. You waste your own time. And I love it that students challenge professors. I know we can feel assailed. We get our committees together. We defend ourselves. We don't like words like microaggression and all the things that we hear, but we hate when a professor does trade grades for sex and these kinds of things. But to me, the great hope in higher education is that I fulfill what I've been trained to do, which is to have a fiduciary responsibility. Like a banker, an accountant, an attorney, I have a responsibility to be a purveyor of information based on fact and evidence and real credible ideas, not just spewing it and flying by the seat of my pants. So I would love, at least in my field, I'm not in the sciences, I'm in the social sciences. So yes, there's a lot of leeway there. But when I'm teaching philosophy or gender communication or ideas out of psychology, I want to be held accountable. And I think if more professors could be trained that way, this school in particular puts me through every 2 years, I don't know if they still do it, an online course that I have to take, and I've done this at other schools, where I have to be schooled for about 2 to 3 hours online, all about how to conduct myself in the classroom, what I'm there for, who are my students, understanding diversity, and so forth.
Thanks.
So if you have some ideas about that, I'm all ears.
Well, let me turn that into a question. Sophia, what his comment makes me think of is that our universities are going through a huge demographic change, right? Racially, to an extent class-wise, I think. The type of student who's enrolled now is very different than the kind of student who was 30, 40 years ago. How is that changing, the education of those students on free speech? Do you find that Black and Latino students are buy in less to the Constitution than do, upper middle class students?
I don't think I would characterize those as the lines of demarcation. I mean, I think that, faculty raising provocations for students is probably not the central issue of a crisis point or something on college campuses. I mean, I think that most faculty are also trying to raise environments, and I am sensitive to the conversation here about how students are disengaged or uncritical of some of the things that might be put in their pathway. And some of that does have to do with the changing demographics or the different kinds of pressures, I think, that students are facing and that campuses are facing. For example, one of the things that I think suppresses a free exchange of ideas is that there's such an economic pressure on institutions and on students. So we see now, for example, students leaving four-year research universities with easily $100,000 worth of debt on their backs. That can have a significant impact on one's ability to feel free to communicate when one is obsessed with getting a certain number of points, getting a particular grade, because they're going to have to translate this amount of debt into an employment opportunity. I see a lot of students shaking their heads. So I know that this is true, and that is certainly the defunding of education, let's say, writ large in the United States, has a huge impact on people's ability to feel free. It's interesting that this metaphor of the marketplace of ideas keeps getting invoked, and for me, what I hear is I see a decrease in state funding for the UC system and for other public university systems around the country, a higher reliance upon private funding and donors, and the incredible influence that those with capital or those with resources have in a marketplace that is quite, in fact, disproportionate to people who don't have it. And so when you think about that, then we start seeing, again, how speech gets contained and constrained by the concerns of administrators who don't want to see certain types of speech happen because litigation may ensue, that's incredibly expensive, it costs them in brand reputation and public relations, and when there's so much competition among universities for students, these universities use brand and reputation as a differentiating factor in attracting a particular type of student body. So I think that the economics of how universities are working, and this is, to me, ultimately a taxpayer issue. If we had public alternatives, whether it's public media like KPCC, or whether it's public universities and public schools, if those were deeply funded, we would not have as much concern about what's happening in these commercial spaces, commercial speech spaces, quite frankly, like social media, because they couldn't undermine and destabilize in quite the same way that they can when huge campaigns are organized to take down a professor, for example, who has a political critique. And I just want to make sure that I speak to, I think it's a little bit of a false equivalency here to say that a professor who critiques politics, whether it's a whole host of issues that professors like to critique, that's actually not the same as a Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter, people documenting rape and sexual harassment and police brutality. That's actually not the same in terms of the uses of social media to document in service of justice or some type of reconciliation around that. The fact that social media is playing such a role in undermining our ability to speak, to me, is fundamental. And if we had more public investment in public speech and public speech spaces, we might not have students conceptualizing speech so much through these private platforms and spaces.
Ramaya, before we go to the next audience question, tell me about the next couple of years for you and how these issues are, you think, going to shape what you do and how you do it in your career moving forward.
Well, I think I can incorporate that into circling back to something that you said in your question, the idea of Black and brown students buying in less to the Constitution.
Do you disagree?
I agree and disagree because I think buying in less to the Constitution would be justified for Black and brown students. This is a document with as painful language as Milo or Ann Coulter would bring to a campus. I am 3/5 of a person, according to that Constitution. That is the same document. It's just as damaging, or some of the language in it is just as damaging as, a provocateur you would want or not want on campus. So in that sense, I think Black and brown students would be, if they are, I don't purport to speak for all of them. I don't purport to speak for all millennials in here, but I think if they buy in less to the constitutional right to the First Amendment or any part of the Constitution, it's because they have a right to. And I think the part of the Constitution that they do buy in more to is the more perfect union part. If they look at the First Amendment and say these issues about free speech, we want to change them. We want to change what is acceptable in our country. We want to change the conduct that's acceptable. Whether or not you agree with that, I think it's worth giving credit where credit is due. That they want to form something that in their mind is more perfect. And I think millennials get a lot of flack for trying to perhaps change the world in that way. But I think that's a generational battleground that we will continue to fight. But what was your original question?
In the next 5 years, 10 years, in the career that you pursue, how is your experience with free speech on your campus and use of social media? How's that going to shape, what you do in whatever career you pick? What do you want to be doing?
Oh, wow. The question a college student doesn't want to hear is, what are you going to do in 5 years? That's so funny. I don't know. But I think my experiences with free speech on campus and struggling with this issue and going back and forth and playing devil's advocate, it's as I continue to be involved in the political life of this country, as I step into, our inheritance, the mess we've inherited as millennials, it's going to make me think more about where people are coming from. And I think, if anything, this issue on both sides has shown, and both sides meaning, students who want to bring these speakers to campus and students who want to protest them, people have motivations and reasons, and if we refuse to acknowledge that, no matter how vile we find those motivations, no matter how disagreeable we find those reasons, we end up with this mess that we're in. I had professors form environments in classrooms that were so toxic that I could only sit there and think, if there is, for example, a Trump supporter in this room, I would feel so disrespected. I would feel so, I would feel so outcast. I would feel so silenced that why in the world wouldn't I vote for the one person that makes me, that says what I think is valuable? Whether or not I agree with what they're thinking, I can sympathize with that. And I think empathy and sympathy for that situation is something we're so missing. And that's coming from me, a person that has a lot of stake in the game when it comes to our current,
Sophia, you have
political
something to say?
climate.
I mean, I really, I think that, Ramaya, your comments remind me of the kinds of conversations that are happening in classrooms right now that my colleagues and I talk about. And one of the challenges here is that, the lack of critical engagement with the fundamental ideas that are at stake in a democracy, and the kind of way in which we engage. I'm Gen X. We actually knew that there wouldn't be Jack here available for us when we became adults. And so, there's no expectation whatsoever, I think, in my generation about a safety net of any sort. And so the idea in which that our feelings would matter was actually never kind of part of the socialization or sensibility, let's say, of my friends and I. And so this means that if a critical conversation happens about what are the tenets of fascism, let's just say we read the book, the new Madeleine Albright book, let's say, and we're trying to understand the tenets of authoritarianism. That might not be the starting book, but let's say that we make a very mainstream book like this. If people in the classroom have a visceral response to authoritarianism and fascism, and that it doesn't feel good, that's actually what we want in a classroom. We want people to have to engage with why am I uncomfortable at the thought that any sector of the society is clamoring for their civil rights or their human rights, nationally or internationally? What are the nuances and the contours of that? That's actually a really different thing than having this conversation makes me feel uncomfortable. Universities are places where ideas are debated, and those conversations are not comfortable, including for me, quite frankly. I have plenty of students who disagree or agree with all kinds of materials that I put in front of them. That's actually the project of the university, is to engage with all of these multiple ways of knowing. And I think that's actually something we have to distinguish from feeling like we don't feel powerful in those conversations and we feel shut down and silenced. How you embolden people to not feel silenced and shut down is to give them more speech, to bolster free speech, and to really make that like a fundamental
and give them the tools
way of
to
thinking
engage,
in our
right?
society, which is not to me about, some of the discourse that surrounds our notions of speech right now.
Okay. Do we have, we've got a question over here.
I'm not a student here, but I think in general we should start learning more about free speech and diverse discourse earlier in life. I think waiting until college, especially with social media and, being able to click the accept button on Facebook and Twitter when you're 13, we already have these issues going on with high schoolers. When you look at the Florida Parkland kids and them being attacked by other adults online, even though it's still considered free speech, we still, I think we're waiting way too late to tackle the issue.
We need to start early. That makes me think that if, administrators can, clamp down on college faculty, principals can definitely clamp down on public school teachers, right? Sure. Right. Do you get any cases like that? Fire?
So the law is different in K-12 schools than it is in college, and FIRE is a small organization with we're very narrowly focused just on higher education, but I completely agree with your comment. And one thing and this is a need that we recognize, and we've been working on doing more outreach to high school students and teachers, and developing a curriculum that would teach teachers could use to teach their students about free speech and about the First Amendment. And I think, particularly the need to really, engage with and listen to opposing viewpoints. I think that the earlier we start teaching those things, the better. Because I think, if a student arrives at college not understanding the right to free speech or supporting the right to free speech, it's not necessarily too late, but you're starting at a real disadvantage there.
David Snyder, how good of a job or how poor of a job are public schools doing in teaching these things?
Well, I'm not an expert on what the status of civics education is in secondary or below schools, but I understand that it has sort of gone away. I don't know that that's the case. I took civics. It's getting late. I took civics in high school. But I'm a generation ago, so I do hear a lot of people saying that, and I hear a lot of people saying what Sam was saying and what the student up there said, that there is a delay, at least, in understanding just the basics about our structure of government and the Constitution and what the Bill of Rights says and how the Bill of Rights fits into the Constitution. The basic building blocks that I don't know how much of this is legend and urban myth, but I hear again and again that these basic things were always taught in 7th grade or 8th grade or whenever it was, and they're rarely taught anymore.
Well,
if that's true,
right?
in
the public
bad.
School teachers I've talked to have said that because of the push for testing in the last decade, 15 years or so, because of that push, other items, not English or math, the items that are tested, have fallen by the wayside.
Yeah.
So some of the civics teachers I've talked to have said, well, if you test for civics, if you make it, and here's, careful what you wish for, make a standardized test for this kind of knowledge, it'll get done, right?
Yeah. I just want to say we've seen what a generation of high-stakes testing has done, which when we talk about a pipeline to the college, means that, and I can tell you, I have students who've come up to me after class and say, how many points did I get today for speaking? And it's like, that's not how we're doing this. So, a generation of high-stakes testing also it suppresses, again, the mechanics, the critical thinking mechanics that one needs to be able to engage in all kinds of discourse. In the state of California, I know that just after the presidential election, our legislature passed, I don't know if this is funded legislation yet, but is now requiring critical digital media literacy, critical media literacy to be taught in K through 12. So I think this is good news. And, certainly for a scholar like me who studies disinformation and misinformation online, it's very important to understand, again, how media works, particularly online media, and making distinctions critically between disinformation, misinformation, evidence-based, fact-based knowledge that is contested and questions that simply can't be answered quickly. And I think that, again, these are the kinds of public measures that we should be invested in and putting pressure for funding on, because they really bolster this kinds of, fundamentally what you're asking, which is how do we have greater civic participation and engagement, and that requires critical thinking, and that's central to democracy.
Yeah. So, Joseph, I want to come back to you, and I want to ask if there's a question in the audience, but let me give you the question I'm going to ask you so you can think about it for a little bit. I just want you to talk about the work that you're going to map out for yourself here on campus the next couple of years in terms of working with students and that sort of thing. What's left to do?
I think digital literacy is key. Going back to that very same course that I taught, the freedom for the thought that we hate, I tried to impose on students the idea that sources matter, not only their text, but the databases they use to find the text, because databases don't fall from the sky, somebody builds them. And so digital literacy is critical. And of course, misinformation, when you are at a research institution, students need to understand, well, of course, how to make an argument, but the sources. And so that's one area. But I think, it's the initiatives that I mentioned, confronting extremism, perspectives on bias, prejudice, and bigotry. I mean, those are a work in progress, as I imagine similar initiatives are across the nation, right? I mean, I think we're doing our best to protect freedom of expression, but also develop an inclusive environment.
Great, thank you. So let me ask if we have, we'll take just a couple more questions and then I'll ask for final comments from the panelists. Yeah?
How do we balance an institution's responsibility to protect freedom of speech versus its duty to provide a safe learning environment free from harassment and discrimination? So how can we kind of hold both of those, and how do we find that balance?
Yeah, who wants to tackle that? Yeah, Samantha?
Well, at sort of the most basic level, harassment is not protected speech. Now, what harassment means legally is different from what a lot of people sort of colloquially would understand harassment to mean. But harassment, which the Supreme Court has defined as conduct that's so severe and pervasive and objectively offensive that it essentially denies someone the educational benefits of an institution, that's not protected. And I think that, back to the conversation about cyberbullying, I think that a lot of what we would consider really severe cyberbullying would fall into that context, because if it's, and it's judged by the standard of a reasonable person, but if it's conduct that would essentially prevent you from going to, if you're changing your route to class, if you're avoiding going to class, if there's a pattern of conduct that's having that impact and would have that impact on a reasonable person, which is sort of a legal standard, then that's not protected. It's actually considered a form of discrimination. I do think that sort of more broadly there's been an expansion of what that term means colloquially, and there is, too often an idea that students should have the right to sort of feel comfortable at all times. But as you said, feeling comfortable all the time is not what college should be about. And having to hear the opinions of someone who opposes illegal immigration or opposes, say, transgender rights, if they're not attacking you personally and using their views to target you, but if they're stating a political view that as a member of a particular group you find offensive, that's not harassment. I mean, that's engaging with an idea that you might find uncomfortable. So I think, the law does a pretty good job, I think, of drawing that line, of balancing that right to be free from genuine harassment and discrimination, but also the right to protect free speech. But too often we do see schools sort of straying beyond that, and maybe cracking down on speech that simply makes somebody feel uncomfortable. But the parameters for that do exist, and I think, genuine harassment is an important category of unprotected speech.
Okay, let's get one more last question, and then I'll get comments from the panelists.
Lisa, I'm a student here at UCI, and I was wondering, back on the earlier topic of free speech zones in the university restricting speech, could one argue that the university has a financial stake in restricting our freedom of speech? One thing that is the hardest problem for students is the rise in tuition, where we have to pay $30,000, $40,000, whereas prior generations paid a couple thousand. And if you look at, in Quebec in 2012, where 62,000 students got
So you're saying if they don't allow protests, they will be able to pass tuition increases and that sort of thing?
If we have more freedom of speech and protests were more common here amongst the university, where people were free to project their opinions, and our tuition's constantly rising, one and one together would equal us obviously being against the tuition rises. So couldn't you argue that the university is financially, has financial, basically, necessity of restricting our freedom of speech? That goes against our students' best interests?
Thank you.
Of course, it's in administrators' best interest to not see students and faculty in particular align in protest around tuition costs. I was educated in the California State University system here at Fresno State, in fact, who's in the headlines right now, around these issues. And faculty and students were actually in the streets in the early 90s protesting tuition hikes because fundamental to our democracy, again, we argued that access to a high-quality education is imperative You can't have a flourishing democracy if you don't have the public educated. And this is one of the reasons why California at one time had the greatest higher education system in the world, from our community college, Cal State, and UC systems. So sure, there's an interest in limiting or curtailing or socializing, even in a more using kind of soft power to discourage these kinds of alignments. And one of the things that I see happening more broadly on college campuses to diminish the previous political alliances that really were very strong between students and faculty here in California is the rise of kind of what I've called the student affairs industrial complex, which is the huge investments in student affairs kinds of programs and staff and people. My husband's probably dying right now because he's worked in this field in the past, but we agree on this. In that a whole buffer group of people and administrators where really a huge part of those tuition increases are going to fund that. I mean, we've seen a huge shrink in the kinds of support and services that faculty need. We see the adjunctification of the faculty, which is, of course, about diminishing voice in faculty governance, making faculty precarious in our labor and otherwise. And so that buffer class actually plays a huge role, in my opinion, around cultivating the feelings discourse about how hard the university is, how hard it is in the classroom, how painful the faculty make students' lives. And parents are also implicated in this because they want their kids to be comfortable at all times. And so, they also pose a challenge to what previously were the kinds of alliances that I think helped contain tuition increases and other kinds of priorities that maybe faculty and students wouldn't agree with.
So let's wrap this up. Really quick answer to this from all of you, one at a time. Samantha, what gives you hope in the work that you do and the cases? So tell me the one thing that gives you hope about this issue of free speech, social media on college campuses.
The thing that gives me hope is that every time I have a conversation, a face-to-face conversation about this, whether it's with somebody who agrees with me on a lot of issues or who disagrees with me on a lot of issues, everyone seems to agree that something is broken, that we're too polarized, that our civil debate has broken down. I don't think we've yet figured out how to get back there, but I think that most people want to get back there.
How about you, Sophia? What gives you hope?
I think that, with the recent headlines about social media companies in particular, Facebook and all the rest should be on deck because they'll also be in the news. I think that the distrust of these kinds of corporate platforms as the sole arbiter of our speech acts.
And the voicing of that distrust.
Exactly.
Right?
I think that is starting, the edges are pulling back on that, and that's a good thing. And, while we're having conversations in DC about regulation, one of the things I consistently argue is that we also must fund public alternatives, and I think I'm hopeful about that.
Ramaya, what gives you hope?
My peers give me hope. This generation is on the streets. It's moving things forward. It has fully come into its inheritance and accepted its responsibility to make a better world for the generation after us. And I think with regards to the issue of free speech, we don't have it figured out. The generation before us didn't have it figured out, but we're willing to give it that go. And I've seen such enthusiasm and such passion from my peers on both sides. And whether or not there's a rift between them, we're talking, we're moving, we're acting. And I think the worst thing possible would be a stoic generation.
Yeah. David, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is that we've seen over the last 2 years especially more people exercising their First Amendment rights in more prominent and robust ways than I think we have in a long time. And I think one of the reasons they're doing that is because of all of the problems that we've identified here. But hey, people are recognize that. More people are having conversations like we're having right here. And some people say talk is cheap, but I think the First Amendment rests on the opposite idea. It's the opposite of cheap. It's what really finally makes a difference.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks. Why don't you give our guests a hand? Thank them for being here. And I'd like to give a very special thank you to the University of California, Irvine for hosting us. Thank you very much. And the First Amendment Coalition and KPCC's in-person team. A lot of people worked on putting this together. We hope you all stay in touch with KPCC and join us at another event soon, please. I will see you on the radio. So thank you very much and have a good night.